Okay, now we're going to take some notes for part 2 of the communication technology worksheet that you should have already printed out and should already be about halfway done. We're going to talk about graphic communication. And graphic communication is communication by printed or visual form. So with a little bit of thought you can figure out that this is probably the #1 type of communication in our society today. Anything that's printed, anything that you see would be graphic communication, and that would really include a lot of the things that we have out there. Some of your examples that you want to put in your notes would be newspapers and magazines, television, computer monitors, signs and billboards, and symbols of any kind. Telecommunications comes from the stem tele, which means long distance or far away. Telecommunication is communication over long distance. Tele means far. Examples of telecommunication would be television, telephone, telegraph, telescope, or the internet. It does not have to have the word tele in it, but I used a lot of those examples to indicate how it's used. Obviously we call the television the TV and abbreviate that, and we simply call a telephone a phone, but their original terms were using the word tele. So telecommunication is communication over a long distance. Wave communication is when the message is carried by energy through liquids, gases, or solids. Examples would be sonar, which goes through liquids or solids, radar, which goes through air, and we use that to keep track of the airplanes that are flying around our country at any time, X-rays, which is through solids like the human body or any other thing, and radio and television or air waves. These are examples of wave communication. Now, when we're looking at the methods of communication, we can divide them into 4 methods, and this will be on the test. Methods classifies what is communicating with what. So what is the sender and what is the receiver? To help remember the methods, we're going to associate them with the letter M and M, or M, and refer to the thought of the concept of M&Ms as in the picture up on the right. So in order to make it simple, we don't mean to be sexist or to cut anybody out, but in order to keep it simple, we're going to refer to everything as the M&Ms. This can be very confusing, so you want to look at the last sender in a situation. What I mean by that is if we're taking, for example, television, you have a lot of different steps. You have when the television was originally started, when the actors were acting and the camera was taking it, when it was edited for the final look, when it was sent to the company, when it arrives to your home, and there's a lot of different steps. So in order to keep it simple, we always want to look at what is the last step. Now, the first method we're going to look at is man-to-man. So we're thinking mankind, not just a male. Again, we could say a woman to a man, a teacher to a student, an adult to a child, any number of combinations here, and we want to try to simplify it and try to make it as less confusing as possible. So we're going to lump everybody into one concept, and we're going to call them mankind. The sender is a man, and the receiver is a man. So man-to-man would be a person talking to a person. Or if you're talking over a cell phone, perhaps, you're not really talking to the cell phone, you're talking to the person at the other end. So it would be mankind to mankind, or man to man to make it simple. Examples would be talking on the phone, email, text messaging, letters, t-shirts. When you're wearing a t-shirt that has printing on it, you're sending that person a message. For example, if you have a Colts shirt on, one would assume that you probably like the Colts. That's the message you're sending to that other person. So again, we want to be clear about this. The shirt, just by itself, a plain empty shirt, would not have a message. But if it has writing on it, then it would. Texting, again, you're sending the message, a man is sending the message, and a person or man is at the other end receiving the message. It's not really the phone that's getting the message. That is the tool or the technology that we're using to send the message to the other person. So let's say that I go over to the computer and I sit down to the computer and I start typing on the keyboard, which is our current method of communicating. If we look at the sender would be a person or a man, and the receiver would be a machine. So again, we're keeping or maintaining that M&M concept just to make it simpler and to help jog your memories. A lot of times when students in the classroom take the test, they forget the methods, and then once I give them one of them, they automatically know the other four. It's fairly simple. It's just a matter of remembering it. So the next method is man to machine. The sender is a man, the receiver is a machine, just like when you're typing on the computer. Examples would be, as I mentioned 3 times now, typing on the keyboard, leaving a message on an answering machine, or using a mouse, a graphic tablet, or a joystick to send information to the computer. Now again, we don't want to overcomplicate this. If we look at leaving a message on an answering machine, we're trying to stay in a small frame. When you leave that message, you're talking to a machine. When somebody gets that message, that then becomes a different scenario or a different method. So let's explore that. You call and you leave a message for a friend of yours on their answering machine. They get home, they go click the button, and what happens? Well, the machine sends the message to the man. So the next method is machine to man. The sender is a machine, the receiver is a man or a person. Examples would include the computer monitor as you're sitting there watching it, television, watching television, a DVD, the clocks on the wall, school bells. And as we're talking about all these things, if you remember the 24-hour recall project that we did, here are a lot of examples of things that could have been used on that if you so chose. So again, and for some reason I have a lot of students that claim that watching television is machine to man. And again, the television's not watching you, you're watching the television. Now, if I had a remote in my hand and I used that remote, that might change the situation. So, let's explore this. Where is the information stored? And at what point does it stop? Now again, it can be picked up and it can start again. As we go back to the answering machine concept, you send that information to the answering machine, it is stored, it is received later from somebody else. So we have a lot of different situations of this. It can be a little confusing. For example, reading a book. Is the book communicating to you, or is the author communicating with you? And that can be a little bit confusing, and we probably could argue the point several hours to determine which way we think that would be accurate. So in order to avoid that argument, I just skipped it. But let's say you're watching television and you don't like the show that's on, so you pick up the remote control. Well, when you press that button, you're sending a message from a machine to a machine. So a machine is the sender, and a machine, the TV, is the receiver. Examples of this method would be computer to printer, sending the data or the information or the binary code, which we'll talk about later in the course, to the printer to print out what design or what idea we want. Robotics, where the computer tells the robot what to do. Sensors and fire alarms throughout a building. And the GPS system. Now again, the GPS system gets its information from the satellite, which is a machine, and then the GPS gives the information to you, which is a person. So again, there's a lot of different steps along different ways, and we try to just pick one and address that one. The next thing we want to talk about are categories, and the way that communication can be divided up into categories. So methods is what is communicating with what, and categories are another way, and it addresses how is that communication happening. So once again, to repeat, methods is what it's communicating with what. Categories would be how this is happening. Again, just like methods, there are 4 categories that we can divide communication into. And it can get, again, I know it can get a little confusing. The first one we're going to look at is communication that happens by sound only. And this is called audio. So anything that communicates by sound only is called audio. And that means you hear the message only. Now again, this can get a little bit confusing. I can see the radio and I hear the music coming from the radio, but by seeing the radio doesn't give me any communication. Now again, we can argue, we can go and say, well, it tells me what radio station I'm on, or it can tell me what time I'm on. And that is true, but we want to simplify this and assume I'm just listening to the music, and that would be audio only. Examples would be Walkmans and iPods, telephone and cell phones, CDs and cassettes. Now again, when we look at all of these, for example, the telephone, there are things you can see on the telephone, but when you're talking, you're not really looking at those. So it can be a little confusing, and you just need to be clear about what kind of communication is happening or what category is happening at each step of the way. The next category we're going to look at is when the message is transmitted by sight only, and this is called visual. So sight means the message, again, the important part is the message, is visual. Graphic communication, which was our first term in this section, that would all be visual. And this means you can only see the message. Examples would be billboards and signs, pictures, shirts, clothing with a message on it, we've already talked about that, newspapers, books, and magazines. And this is a little bit easier. We talked about books and how confusing that is. Is the book a machine, or is it the author that's communicating with the reader? And I kind of like the feel that it's the author communicating with the reader, and it would be man to man. But we could certainly argue the point. Now, if you think about this a little bit, we talked about audio, which is where you hear only, and we talked about visual, which is where you see only. So the next category would be both, and what we call that is audio visual, or we abbreviate it by A/V, and that means the media is sent, or the information is sent and received by both sight and sound, and that is called audio visual. Examples would be the computer most of the time. The old computers, the early computers, were all visual. The current computers do a lot more now and probably are mostly audio-visual. But again, it would depend on the circumstances or the situation. Television, movies are audio-visual. Plays, concerts, DVDs, entertainment systems, all of these are both audio and visual, and you communicate or you get the information by both sight and sound. The last category is probably one that you may or may not have thought of, and that is other. And that would include all of the other senses that we have. Taste. When you taste something and it's rotten or sour or burnt or any number of other things, the recipe wasn't correct. All of these would be a different type of communication. And for communication technology, we don't spend a lot of time on this one, but it is out there, and it is one that you need to be able to recognize. In this category, we are really at a big disadvantage to animals. The things that would be under this category: touch, smell, and taste. And again, these are probably things that you didn't think of in your 24-hour recall assignment, but it's still out there. Some dogs can smell 500 times better than people. One single part of smell in a room can be picked up by some dogs, whereas people wouldn't smell it at all. They're also experimenting with the concept of using bees in airports to smell explosives. They're training the bees that when they smell this, they will swarm to that area and indicate that there's a problem. I have read about this, and that's why I included it in here. I've never really heard whether it's successful or not. Having bees fly around a lot of people, even though bees probably wouldn't attack, still makes me a little bit nervous. Now I want to talk about the communication process, and we're going to look at this a little bit more in detail later, and we're going to relate this to the technology process. The technology process has 4 different parts: input, process, output, and feedback. And we're going to talk about that a little bit and relate it specifically to communication. It's a little bit different, but the overall concept is the same. When we're talking about a technology process, the first thing is input. Input is the things that will go into the system that we need. That would be money, cost, time, machines, any number of things. There's seven or eight different things that we can put into input. When we're talking about communication process and relating that to the technology process, however, the input is called the sender or the source, and this is where the message is coming from. So the input going into the communication system is the sender. Now, all of the things that you need, the cell phone or the TV or whatever it might be, we just kind of lump that all together to make it simpler. The next step in the technology process is what we call the process, and that's the activity. That's what happens. Things, for example, if we were looking at transportation, once we get the input in, the process would be simply driving to your destination, and that would be the process. With communication, however, we call this the channel, and the channel is how the message travels from the sender to the next step. Channels can be either atmospheric or physical. Physical would be the actual wires or the cords going to it. For example, the wiring going to your computer, the internet coming into your computer, the phone or the lines on your landline phone at home. These would all be things that would be physical. Atmospheric would be things like light waves or sound waves. While we can't see these are actually floating through the air, and they're going from, for example, sound waves, they're going from the vibration in the throat of one person to the ears of another person. Light waves do the same thing. The light reflects off of something, and it gives you the illusion or the images or the colors that are present. For example, if it reflects blue, you see blue. If it absorbs blue, you see all of the other colors. If you see all of the colors, that would be white. If you see none of the colors, that would be black. So the reflection of light off of something gives us the illusion or the idea of what colors those would be. And that would be examples of the atmospheric channel. The next thing, and this might not surprise you, is the receiver. Now, normally that's called output in the technology process, but for what we're doing, it's called the receiver. So the sender sends the information through the channel, and it's received. This is called one-way communication, or this is called an open system. So let's say that I'm listening to the radio. The radio would be the sender, the sound waves would be the channel, and I would be the receiver. Now, I can talk back to the radio as long as I want, and it's never ever going to receive the information. So we're really not communicating. It's only going in one direction. And this is called one-way communication. And that should be at the bottom of your notes. Now, let's say you're talking to a friend. You are the sender. The channel would be your light waves or your airwaves, and goes to your friend, who would be the receiver. Your friend, in turn, replies to you. And that's called feedback. And that is the same both in the technology, the general overall technology process, as well as the communication process. And it's called feedback. Let's say that I buy a product at the supermarket. I buy chocolate milk, and I really like that chocolate milk, and I send the information through a letter to the company, who would be the receiver. They then send me feedback in return, telling me that they appreciate my input and giving me maybe a free coupon to go buy some more of their product. So this is called a closed loop system, and the information can pass back and forth repeatedly over and over again. It's important to note that all of this doesn't have to be done at the same time. For example, you could send information, you could send an email to somebody, and maybe days later they get back to you. They were not able to get to the computer, they were gone for a while, or whatever it might be. However, in today's world, with all the communication technology that we have, it's really hard sometimes to not be around the information around us. And again, we talked about the open loop system, which is sender, channel, receiver. and the closed loop system, which includes feedback, and that is the main difference.